We're here for another week of class with no notes, no texts, no holds barred. All the scary parts removed. I want this week to talk about the Akeida. The title of this class that I chose was "Who was killed at the Akeida?" or "Who died at the Akeida?" The Akedah, of course, being connection with the Parsha, the binding of Isaac, famous story found in the book of Genesis, in which God asks Abraham to offer his son up as an offering, and he takes Isaac and he binds him up on the altar on the mountain. And of course, an angel tells Avram that he doesn't need to offer his son, he can offer the ram. They look up and they see the ram, and the ram is offered in the place of Isaac. A very mysterious story, one of the most poorly understood and frankly abused passages of the Torah in its interpretation. It's abused in various ways. For example, the entirety of Christianity has a very different view on the Akedah than Jews do, because they see it as a prologue. Well, they see all of Judaism as a prologue to Christianity, but this story in particular, with its sacrifice and that sort of thing, they see as a prologue to their story. The Muslims, for what it's worth, also have their interpretation for other reasons, because for them they have a whole Isaac and Ishmael thing where they have their story is quite different, and they say everything that we say about Yitzchak is really about Yishmael, and it's all backwards. That's just outside of Judaism. Inside of Judaism, the story is also poorly interpreted. For example, many people like to say that somehow the ethical meaning of this story of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac, is the idea that Judaism does not believe in human sacrifice, which is, number one, does not make sense in the context of the story in the Torah, because as we spoke about in our last class, Abraham was far from an idolater who would believe in human sacrifice at the point where this story takes place. On the contrary, he has been living a perfectly observant Jewish life for many years already at this point. And the idea that somehow Abraham needs this whole demonstration, and the Jewish people need this demonstration for all time, not to be a idolatrous death cult that offers up children or human beings to God on an altar, is somewhat ridiculous given the rest of the story of Avram in Jewish sources. It's a very what would I call it? It's a very sociological way of explaining the Torah, rather than something that is respectful of the various midrashim and Judaism's, what would you call it, internal self-consistency, which when you judge any system of thought, you have to judge it in an internally self-consistent way, right? You have to judge it in terms of itself, right? The main, any faith-based system, which is most of the systems that exist, if not all, can ultimately only really be criticized and understood from the inside, right? You can only understand it in terms of itself, and the real questions that negate systems are questions of self-contradiction, right? You can't negate a system from the outside because you're not respecting its assumptions and its worldview, right? You're trying to criticize it as a different system, and at the end of the day, the question is, why should I care about your perspective and your system, right? The real criticism, such as it is, if such a thing exists, has to be internal criticism, internal understanding. How does Judaism understand the Akedah, the binding of Isaac? Furthermore, in addition to that angle on why the human sacrifice explanation is unsatisfactory, there is a further reason why it's unsatisfactory. You know what the further reason is? The further reason is that human sacrifice is required in Judaism. Not on an altar, not like the Aztecs, right? But unfortunately, many are the Jews who have died and who have had their children die for Judaism throughout the ages. The idea that we are so above God asking for death is not accurate. On the contrary, it's the holiest thing in its way. Obviously, we don't seek out this sort of thing. Although even on that, we have a footnote from Rabbi Akiva. Right, Rabbi Akiva said that all of his life, as they were murdering him, he told his students that all of his life he had yearned to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, and he was finally getting the opportunity. The Rebbe has some interesting talks about that, distinguishing between Avram and Rabbi Akiva, because Avram's self-sacrifice was such that he wasn't seeking it, whereas Rabbi Akiva was at different levels, different types. Each one has its advantage. But the truth is of course that we don't seek to die for God in Judaism. We're a religion based on life, as even our enemies know and have stated in very recent history. We're a religion focused on life and on living for God. But nevertheless, we have on many an occasion had opportunity, and in fact even been perhaps required to not live for God, but rather to die for God, and even for our family to die for God, which just makes the whole question even stronger. What is exactly the meaning of the Akeida? And really, it's a murder mystery. As I said at the beginning, that's the title. We have a murder mystery, and it's a whodunit. Because someone is killed at the Akeida, and I don't just mean the ram. There is someone important that dies at the Akeida. But the person who dies at the Akeida is implicit in the story, is not explicit in the story. You have to understand a lot of context to understand who dies at the Akeida. And the truth is that the lesson is very relevant for everything that's going on now. It's a very relevant story to current events in every way, in multiple ways. It's relevant. I would like to connect this class to the previous class to start. The previous class was about Lech Lecha, was about idolatry, Abraham revoking idolatry, becoming a heretic to idolatry, becoming the first, what we tentatively call monotheist, right? The first Jew, certainly. Why are there traditions of human sacrifice in idolatrous cults? Why would communities sacrifice a human being? And there's all sorts of sociological explanations. But again, the usual sociological approach, as we discussed this a little bit last time as well, or I was discussing it with someone recently, that the sociological approach is very disrespectful in general, because we view idolaters as very backwards and warped and barbaric, when in fact, most of the things that they do are things that we still do nowadays. We just do them in a slightly different form. And where the exact difference lies, there is a difference, but where the exact difference lies is obfuscated by that sense of superiority. And it's funny because, even though nowadays we're very postmodern, and we know deep down that these senses of superiority that we have as based in modern sources, like in modern science and modern civilization, are very misplaced in general. And on what did we base this sense of on what did the 19th century or 19th century German Academy base its sense of superiority over the savages? And the answer is that, number one, it's not much remains of what they based it on, and we don't believe in any of it anymore, right? And number two, half of it was turned around and used on people in their own society. Namely, where do you think all the academic roots of the anti-Semitism that formed the Holocaust came from, right? The entire German Academy was rotten with anti-Semitism and their racialist theories, which, by the way, the racialist theories of the Nazis, a lot of them were innovated in this country by the academia in this country. We'll come to that. Eugenics and all of that is very American, but as an intellectual thing. But in other words, I'm not impressed by modern explanations of why idolatry is so backwards. And in general, we have, as in our society, there's very few remnants left of that perspective. Around science, there's a certain aura where the difference between us and the benighted savages is our science and our scientific progress. But I think if you really understand what goes on in the human sacrificial cult of the Aztecs and their attempts at magic, you won't find that science is so different, right? In fact, you could very well argue that the monotheistic view, which is the view that God runs the world, God creates nature, God creates man, and it's man's job to adapt to the reality of God, right, is on one side. And on the other hand, you have science and the occult idolatries and politics and magic, which are all really the same thing. They're all on the other side, which is the side that nature is here to be manipulated and conquered. We are here to take over the world, manipulate it, use it to our ends, form it into a greater perfection. And in fact, since I'm already on my soapbox and talking about things that have nothing to do with the Akeida, you may as well know that many of the founding practitioners of modern science and its most brilliant scientists were also occultists and very into the idea of magic, alchemy, spirits, and all of that. And the beginning, the birth of science was the most superstitious and occult period in the history of Western civilization, much more than the benighted Middle Ages, which were much less occult, just FYI. But anyway, all of this is water under the bridge. The point is, why would there be human sacrifice in idolatrous cults? And really, we explained it last week already, the basis of it, right? Idolatry is not an irrational pursuit, it's a rational pursuit, right? The height of rationality, really, and here again, you'll see that in modernity, nothing has changed. It's all the same thing, right? The height of rationality is that there is a certain form, there is a certain there is a certain nature or essence to something that has certain powers and dispositions that makes it better than something else, right? For example, the Aristotle noted, and I don't think the Torah Lahavdil disagrees, we also make this distinction, that the sun has a much more eternal and consistent reality than anything that takes place on the face of the earth. Things on the face of the earth come into being and pass away. They're not consistent. Nowadays, in the modern view, we would say something much more like the sun is more mathematically predictable, which is saying the exact same thing in different words, right? Because the idolatry of science, if you want to be crass about it, is all around mathematics. Mathematics is eternal. Mathematics is orderly. Mathematics is rational, right? And the sun is a much more mathematically predictable being than anything that takes place beneath the sun. Beneath the sun, it's as if relatively chaos reigns, whereas in the heavens, right? And note that the early scientists were all obsessed with astronomy. In the heavens, everything has a certain logic to it, right? Everything has a certain mathematical beauty, which is much more pleasing than to a certain set of mind, to a rationalistic mindset, than the multifarious, limited, diverse, and disorderly realm on the face of the earth. And therefore, if you note that the sun has a much more mathematical, orderly, eternal, predictable, transcendent, consistent reality, it begins to make a certain amount of sense. Number one, that the sun is above us, which we discussed last time, right? Because even if you believe in God, you can believe that God appoints the sun to feed the crops, etc. And number two, that it should be a human aspiration to be like the sun, to be measured by the sun. And so you have, in all ancient idolatries all across the world, you have sun cults and moon cults worshiping the celestial bodies. In the Gemara, the term for idolatry is Avedas Kechavim, worship of the stars. Once you are worshiping the sun and you believe that it's the highest being, and you believe that that it is responsible for your sustenance, and that it represents, and this is the key, this is very key here, this is the main point, you realize that it represents a higher form of being, right? Being a human being is so finite, it's so limited, it's so non-eternal, it's so involved in constant change. The days are short and filled with suffering, right? Whereas the sun is glorious. The sun gives life to all the earth, while it itself remaining pure, transcendent, consistent, mathematically pleasing, utterly rational, right? The sun has a higher form of existence. And not only that, there's also a rational side of things, which says, also very consistent with Greek philosophy, by the way, that if human beings depend on the sun, right, then in some sense the sun not only is higher than us, but we already exist within the sun in some profound way, in potentia, and in a potential way that is higher and greater. And it's much better to be a potential in the sun, a potential human being in the pure energy, in the pure transcendent order of the sun, than to be an actual human being here on earth, right? And you can see how it's not such a long leap from here, that if you're an Aztec and you worship the sun and you measure all things by the sun, and you need the sun to perpetuate not just your life, but the life of your entire civilization, which is rightfully worshiping the sun, right? So your ritual would evolve where you take a human being, right, and you cut out their heart in a very ritualized way, which is directed towards the sun. And of course, you believe that the sun has some sort of consciousness which can be directed back towards you and make this connection. Because of course, if a human being exists in potential in the sun, then the consciousness of a human being and everything that a human being possesses, right, the sun is more rational, again, more rational, more profoundly like the human mind than the human mind is like itself, right? So the sun, in some profound sense, knows that you're doing this, right? And you, by sacrificing this human being and cutting out their warmth, which is how the Aztecs literally viewed it, right? And to return this warmth to the warmth of the sun, the true warmth, the great warmth, the true fire, right? In such a ritual, not only are you not hurting the person you're doing this to, you're giving them eternal rational reality in something that is much higher and much more perfect than themselves. You're returning them to the true source of their being, and they become subsumed in a higher reality than themselves. Most people in our society, for some reason, have never heard a single defense of Aztec human worship. So now I'm very glad to have shared this with you, that it's a very rational thing. It has it's not so barbaric as you might imagine. On the contrary, as the Torah always insists, I believe I mentioned this in the last class as well, as the Torah always insists, the reason we stopped worshiping idols was not primarily because we're smarter, but because we are much less spiritually sensitive than the ancient people were. And the ancient people, seeing the sun and its glory, would have been much more moved. It was like a society more of poets, where everyone was like a great poet in their society, with a much more spiritual sensitivity to that which gives them life and to the glories of nature and the glories of rational realities. So the fact that we today do not go to the county office and all witness a human sacrifice in the name of the sun is not because of our sophistication, right, or intelligence. That is not the reason why. The real reason why is, of course, because of Avram. That's the real reason why. But even if there hadn't been an Avram, that wouldn't be. Why not, right? Anyway, this brings me to the Akeida. As we discussed last week, Avram leaves this whole way of thinking behind. This is all part of what Avram puts behind him. This was the world he grew up in. This was his father's world. Avram discovers God. And not only does he discover God, but his discovery of God and his integrity that allows him to discover God, as we discussed last week, makes him some kind of vessel, makes him some kind of person for prophetic experience, which is really where the Torah starts talking about Avram. The Torah starts with him speaking with God. God speaks to Avram, and you have all the stories of last week's parsha and this week's parsha of Abraham's relationship with God. in which Abraham, again, as we mentioned last week, does the very Jewish thing of listening to what God says first, right? Putting what God says before his own understanding, right? He follows what God says. He's he's a lover of God, but he's also a servant of God. And he does what God says because God says it. The Midrash says something very interesting. Abraham faces 10 tests. Famously, the 10 tests of Abraham, some of which I think maybe possibly even the majority of which are not even mentioned in the Chumash, right? It's all in the Midrash, etc. The 10th and greatest of which, and they're in ascending order of difficulty, and the greatest of the tests of Abraham is the Akeida, is the final and greatest test, the binding of Isaac. The Midrash says something very interesting. It says, I believe it's a Midrash. If it's not a Midrash, it's a Gemara. It says that had Abraham not withstood and passed the test of the Akedah, all of his previous tests would have been for nothing. That's what it says. In other words, this test was the one that proved retroactively that all of the tests were worth something. If there hadn't been an Akedah, the other tests would not have been considered substantial, which is a very interesting statement. One of the reasons it's an interesting statement is because one of the previous tests, as we mentioned last week, was Abraham getting thrown in the fiery furnace by Nimrod. Nimrod declared himself a deity, by the way. Abraham, if you read the Midrash, you learn all the different questions that you can ask someone if they tell you that they're a god, right, or that they're God. Because Avram has this whole, as I said, has a whole debate with Nimrod, which is fascinating. He asks Nimrod, if you're God, can you make the sun rise in the west, right? He says, if you're God, why did you allow your father to die? Right? All of these questions are in order. There's a certain order to them, and it's very interesting. We could talk about just that for the whole class, but Abraham, in the end, Nimrod says, "Okay, you're very, very clever, but let's see how clever you are about throwing you in a big oven, right, in a big fiery furnace, and a big barbecue." And of course, God makes a miracle, and Abraham, as all the children who go to Hebrew school know, and Abraham is saved and is not burned in the fiery furnace, which is a story that presages and predicts a story that in the world is more famous because it's more spoken about among Christians who don't have the midrash, don't study the midrash, right, about Avram, right? A story that's much more famous in the book of Daniel, which ironically Jews study much less. So by Jews, the story about Avram is much more famous, and by Christians, the story in Daniel is much more famous. That's a whole other about people who get thrown in the fiery furnace and survive. That's a whole other story as well. Why that may be. The question is if the Akedah had not taken place, why would allowing himself to be thrown in the fiery furnace, which is one of the tests of Avram, why would that be worth nothing? On the contrary, they seem to be fundamentally the same test, right? It's the same test. One is sacrifice your son, because I said so. And the other one is are you willing to die for your belief in the one God, right? And Avram proved many years earlier, when he was a young man or possibly even a child, much earlier in his life, Avram proved that he was willing to die for the one God, and God made a miracle and saved him, right? And now comes the Midrash, and it tells us that without the Akedah, that act of self-sacrifice would not be considered a real act of would not be passing a test. It wouldn't have proven anything great about Avram. It's only because Avram withstands the Akedah, right? To which you could reply, and people have replied, and it's a very you can hear that it's not purely an intellectual question. Many have replied that sacrificing your child is a much bigger sacrifice for a loving parent than sacrificing yourself, right? Avram, as a young man, he doesn't have so much to live for, right? But sacrificing his son in his old age, the son that he's waited for, right? It's a much bigger ask, a much bigger test. But to which the reply has to be, again, that unfortunately throughout history, many Jews have been asked to sacrifice their children. And not only have Jews sacrificed their children for Judaism and for the one God, but they've done so without God asking them to do so. The fiery furnace, when Abraham sacrificed himself, Abraham hadn't met God yet. God hadn't spoken to Abraham yet. Abraham was willing to die for his beliefs ideologically, as it were. But the Akeida, God asks Abraham to do the Akeida, right? If you could argue that if God directly asked me through prophecy to do anything, it would be much easier to do it, right? So what's so great about that? He even asked him, right? Unfortunately, over the centuries, Jews have sacrificed their children, and no one asked them. They weren't asked directly by God. No one was there to tell them that this is the divine plan, right? They were willing to do this. They were willing to do this on faith, as it were, on faith in a different way than Avram. So what's so special about the story of the Akedah? And why is it the only thing that renders the sacrifice in the fiery furnace meaningful, right? That renders it a real successful test. And here we get to the fundamental point, and it's a very, very, very important. It's a fundamental. It's a key teaching of the Rebbe. It's a key sicha. This sicha explains everything. It explains the whole world. It's one of these talks of the Rebbe where everything is illuminated, everything is explained. That I'm telling you now. There is a difference between Jewish self-sacrifice and non-Jewish self-sacrifice. Not only is there a difference in the self-sacrifice that is expected of Jews, it is actually diametrically opposed. The Jewish dying for what you believe in and the non-Jewish dying for what you believe in are not the same thing. That's the key. That's the nakuda. That's the point, right? It really has to do with the true nature of self-sacrifice. People, of course, are willing to die for their beliefs all the time. Martyrs for their beliefs, whatever they are, right? Suicide bombers, I always talk about, I'm sure I've mentioned it in this class at least a dozen times now, the cover of Rage Against the Machine's eponymous album, Rage Against the Machine, in which they have a black and white picture of a Buddhist, I believe a Buddhist monk who set himself on fire in protest of the Vietnam War and burned to death, right? Willing to die for his beliefs. Being willing to die for your beliefs is what the Akeida comes to teach against. In other words, the Akeida is not here to negate the idea of human sacrifice. That human sacrifice in the context of being an idolater and an idolatrous cult, Abraham already knew for his whole life was the wrong thing to do. That's not the point of the Akeida. The point of the Akeida is not to warn you against sacrificing your children, God forbid. And again, the Jews have sacrificed their children. That's not the point. The point is that when a Jew has self-sacrifice, it's not dying for your beliefs. It's not dying for your ideology. It's not dying for your worldview. That's the lesson. That's the lesson. There's a paradox in this, right? The explanation is as follows: Yitzchak, Isaac, the son of Avram, is not just Avram's son personally, right? In other words, Isaac is not just the reason Abraham was so desperate to have a son was not just the regular desire of a couple who have been barren into their old age to have a child. That may be also, but that's not the significance of Isaac. The significance of Isaac, of Yitzchak, the reason Avram wants a son, is the same reason Avram wants everything, because Avram, Abraham, is a servant of God who is obsessed with the divine. He's obsessed with God. He serves God with everything that he is. He doesn't do anything that's not in the service of God. And therefore, he wants a son because at the time, Abraham is synonymous with monotheism on earth. There is no other brand of monotheism on earth. It's not like if Avram closes up shop, you'll still be able to get monotheism at the ancient Sumerian Walmart. That's not going to happen. If Avram closes up shop, he had students and things like that, but no one like him, right? What Avram wanted was to take his belief in God that was merely philosophical, right? And alive only as long as and only as much as the person who understands it is alive, right? And turn it into a family. That's really what Avram wants. That's what makes him the first Jew, right? He wants to take his beliefs and not just have them be philosophical, not just have them be ideological, right? Isaac is going to be the continuation of Judaism on earth. If Isaac is alive, that means Avram doesn't die. What matters to Avram doesn't die, which is the perpetuation of the knowledge of God on earth, which is all that Avram is interested in. That's all Abraham does, is spread the knowledge of the one God and teach about God on earth. So Isaac is the future plan. Isaac is the roadmap. He is the planned future for this entire enterprise, right? Is that this is going to become a familial thing. Isaac is going to continue after Abraham is gone. This is not a plan shared only by Abraham. This is a plan shared by God as well. In other words, when God sends the angels, also in this week's Parsha, to tell Abraham that you're going to have a son, right? This is the understanding. It's not like what I'm saying is it's not like Avram's secret hope, right? Abraham is asking God to give him a son, that God, in order to serve God, in order that the God should be perpetuated on earth, right? And God eventually tells him very, very late that I will give you such a son. I'll bless you with a son from Sarah who can continue this lineage and this mission. Ever since Abraham, Judaism, the being of the Jew and the mission of the Jew are synonymous, right? Isaac is the mission of the Jew. He is the mission of monotheism on earth. What? The very personification of the mission. And then God tells Abraham that I want you to take your son and sacrifice him to me, right? Now, at this point, all your interpretations and your philosophical interpretations of Abraham and of the story, right? People like to imagine that Abraham had all of these doubts and had all of these, that he was conflicted and that there was, that merely the personal death of his son, as thousands of Jews have done throughout history, would have terribly shaken Abraham's faith in God, which is not the Jewish interpretation of Abraham. Abraham's faith in God was pretty good. It wasn't so shaky like that, right? A little personal, this is a person who was willing to be thrown into an oven before he even had prophecy. He was willing to die for God, right? This is not someone who would be so shaky just from a little personal request. And Avram, in fact, is not shaky. He does exactly what God asked. That's what's so great about Avram. In fact, he rushes to do what God asks, as Rashi famously notes. He has zrizus, he has zeal, he gets up early to do this task. He doesn't even drag his feet, right? Which itself is a moral lesson, by the way. There's a big difference between doing the right thing, dragging your feet, and doing the right thing with zeal. Abraham, Avraham Avinu, is asked to sacrifice his son, who is the embodiment of the mission of Abraham and Abraham's worship of God. In other words, it's not just a personal request to kill your son. This is what all of the interpretations, the non-Jewish interpretations, miss about the story of the Akeida. This is not a personal issue, right? only. There's a personal side to it. But it's not a personal issue only. Why? Because Avram was not a personal person. Avram was not a person who lived as a private citizen. Avram lived as a rebbe, as a king, as the source of all monotheism on earth. Avram led many students. There was no distinguishing between the private and public persona of Avram. Avram was, the mission was his being. That was the plan for his son. The challenge is not a personal challenge. The challenge is the challenge to the mission. God asks Avram to sacrifice not the person of Yitzchak, right? Merely the person of Yitzchak as a private individual, right? God asks Avram to sacrifice the future of monotheism on earth, or to put it more simply, God asks Avram to sacrifice Avram's own worship of God. That's the core of it, right? This also explains, by the way, just as a side thing, something else that's not explained by the myriad other interpretations, is why this is always in Judaism seen primarily as Avram's story and not Yitzchak's, even though we know that Isaac was in his 30s, right, and could probably outrun his aged father in a foot race, right? So why is this not a story of Isaac's great self-sacrifice, right? Why is it not about Yitzchak, right? And Yitzchak knows famously, as we know from all the commentaries on the conversation they have as they go up the mountain, right, as we read every morning, Yitzchak knows something is up, right? He knows what this is about, right? But this is not usually in Judaism interpreted as a story about Isaac. This is a story about Avram in Judaism. Generally, we do say that Yitzchak was a korban, was pure like a sacrifice to God, right? And that's his identity. But this story is really a story about Avram, right? It's Abraham that did the binding of Isaac. Isaac is merely there as this sort of stand-in, which is strange if you don't have this interpretation of the story, right? Avram is asked not to sacrifice Isaac as a private individual. He's asked to sacrifice Isaac as the embodiment of everything that Avram believes in and everything that Avram does as worshiping God on earth, including, by the way, the belief that human sacrifice is wrong. Right? In other words, he is asked to sacrifice Abraham knows already that human sacrifice is wrong. He is asked to sacrifice that as well. God comes and asks Avram to do something that is absolutely against not just Abraham's own logic, right? That Abraham has already overcome a long time ago. Abraham's own logic, Abraham's already shown that he follows God first, because when God comes to Avram and he says, go to the land of Canaan and just pick up and move, Avram says, okay, and he does, right? That's Avram, as we famously say in Chassidus, Lech lecha mibeis avicha, right? God, beis avicha, the Av, the father, in Chassidus and Kabbalah, always refers to chachmas, your own wisdom, right? Abraham was willing to set aside his wisdom and go where God told him. Avram was already old hat at setting aside his understanding and following after God, right? Maybe you could say he gets another lesson in it in their debate about the people of Sudan. Maybe he gets a different, it's an interesting wrinkle, which itself is a fascinating story, which deserves its own class. Avram is used to going where God says and not where his understanding says. What's special about the Akeida? The Akeida is against what God says. It's against God's best interests, right? Not only in other words, it's not against what we would say, the way we put it in Chassidus, it's not against Seichel Enushi. It's not just against Seichel Enushi. It's not just against human intellect. It's against Seichel Eloki. It's against the divine intellect, right? Abraham knows that God's plan is that Isaac should continue and spread monotheism on earth. This is not Abraham's idea. This was a blessing from God. Abraham had no children that could continue this mission. God chose and gave him Isaac to continue and further this mission. And now God says that you should destroy Isaac. You should sacrifice your son before he has a chance to perpetuate anything or be his own representative, nothing. Right? You should basically in his youth, his relative youth, you should sacrifice Yitzchak. God is telling Abraham, in other words, and this is again the key. God is telling Abraham, he's asking Abraham, are you willing to sacrifice the God of your understanding? Are you willing to sacrifice the God as you understood him 5 minutes ago for what you know God wants right now? Right? In other words, when God tells Abraham to go out from your father's house and just go somewhere, I'll tell you where on the way. Don't worry about it. I'll tell you where you're moving your whole life to and all of these things, right? Avram could say that this is not I'm willing not to follow my understanding. I'm willing to follow God, right? Why? Because I understand God. Right? Again, I'm willing to set aside my intellect in the story of Lech Lecha. I'm not setting aside the Akeida for a second, right? In the story of Lech Lecha, where God comes and tells Abraham, go to the land of Canaan, right? Avram is a faithful servant of God. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't say, but I don't understand what you're telling me. He goes, right? Why? Presumably, right? Why do we assume he goes? Because for his whole life, he's built this profound appreciation of the reality of God, the goodness of God, the perfection of God, all of these qualities that he knows God has in monotheism. And so if God is asking him to go, it must be the right thing. Right? This is called faith. I don't see why. I don't see the details of what I should do, why it's good, right? But I trust you. It's a personal trust, right? You're asking me to do something. I trust that you're all wise and all knowing and all good. So you tell me to go, I'll go, right? But this is still not the Jewish self-sacrifice. Because trust, even to trust in God based on your understanding and appreciation of God, ultimately means that at some level, God is dependent. Your conception of God, your relationship with God, is dependent on fitting in with the limits of your mind. It's still a finite, a limited, a defined relationship, right? Because God is still behaving. Like I said at the beginning, he's internally consistent. He's not consistent with what I would expect, right? But he's internally consistent. So I subscribe to his system. I subscribe to God's way of doing things, which Abraham did, and God said go, and Abraham was willing to go, which is already an incredibly lofty level. The Akeida is something else. The Akeida is whatever you expect of God and whatever you think, however you think God is meant to work, and whatever you think God's plans are, none of your understandings or consistencies or plans are binding on God in any way whatsoever. Which, a different way of saying that, which is so simple and yet is so not seen by the world, so overlooked, right? Another way of saying this is God is as much of a person as you are. That's all, right? Another person, human beings can be frustrating. Some people may have noticed. Another person, right? Even when you think you have them all figured out and you have them exactly where you want them and you know exactly what they're going to do and they're totally predictable, what do? They ruin all your plans. All your plans are totally ruined. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. A human being is not, despite what some may believe, a machine. A human being is not a deterministic being. A human being is a self. And a self, by definition, if you understand what we mean by self in Judaism, a self has a certain freedom, right? A self has a certain non-conformity to ideas. They aren't the ideas that they think, is the most succinct definition of the human self, right? My Tanya teacher, Uri Kaplun, he should live and be well, who edited the lessons in Tanya. We used to go to his apartment one night a week for his Tanya class. And I have to be honest, we mostly went just to see him. It wasn't really about the what he was teaching, because he's like someone from someone from somewhere else. But the one of the things I remember, a few things that he said have always stuck with me. And one of the things that he told us is that the difference between a cow and a human being, fundamentally, when you take everything else away, what's the fundamental difference between a cow and a human being? A cow looks at the grass and thinks grass. A human being looks at the grass and can think whatever they want. That's the fundamental difference. That's the core difference between a human being and a cow. Or in other words, to put it in fancier language, which is not necessary, but for some reason I find it more comfortable, the fancier language is that the self, right, stands beyond its conceptions. It always stands beyond its ideas, right? So when you think that you've got God all figured out and God has this whole plan and he's going to spread monotheism on earth and he's going to give you a son and he told you that he's going to give you a son and then he gave you that son and that son is the vessel for your hope and God's hopes in partnership, which is the same hope because you're a servant of God and God is commanding you and it's all one thing, right? God, just like a person, is not an idea. He's God. This is when I say God is like a person. People get very nervous, right? But this is what I mean when I say God is like a person, right? God is not like an idea. A person is above an idea. But an idea is something that a person chooses to follow or not follow, right? A person chooses to think about the grass or to think about something else, right? God is the same. There's a higher level where God does not obey all of the things necessarily that you expect of him. Right? And you can ask all your questions. How can a good God do this? And how is this according to God's goodness? And the fact is that those questions also don't need to be answered in a way that you can understand them. Right? You also have no fathoming of the real mind of God. Right? All of your fathomings and understandings and things that you've learned. And we're not saying false understandings. We're saying in Seichel Eloki. Right? This is what the Torah says. The Torah tells you that God works this way. Right? The Torah tells you that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished, right? And then what happens? You live in a world where Hamas can murder Jewish children, for example, right? For example, right? At the death of Rabbi Akiva, right? We read in the Machzor, they ask, "Zu Torah v'zu schara," right? Is this Torah? Is this its reward? This is what Rabbi Akiva gets for being Rabbi Akiva. Yeah, and what does God answer? God answers, "Silence, so it arose in my thought." Because God is a person, right? In other words, it's not you think that your ideas and systems bind God. It's much scarier than that. It's much scarier than that, right? God is a person just like you are. God is like you. He's not like your ideas, which is very scary. Right? Some people forget that there is a you that's not an idea, and that's called idolatry. We'll get to that in a second. God is beyond this expectation. God is beyond this limitation. And this brings us back to the Jewish concept of self-sacrifice. In the Jewish concept of self-sacrifice, right, Avram is not willing to kill his son for what he believes in. He's willing to kill his son against what he believes in. That's the profundity of the Akeida. That's why the Akeida is special. It's not self-sacrifice for your beliefs. The cover of Rage Against the Machine is self-sacrifice for your beliefs, right? The Aztecs are self-sacrifice for your beliefs, right? You have a system, you have a rational system, a logical system. There's a reason to do this. This is accomplishing something, however misguided and askew and built on false foundations it may be. This is the logical conclusion. You're dying for your beliefs. The Akeida, what's special about the Akeida is that it's against your beliefs. And that's who's murdered at the Akeida. What dies at the Akeida? What dies at the Akeida is Avram's conception of God. That's what dies at the Akeida. Avram is willing to sacrifice, and that actually dies, right? That's not saved by the angel. What dies is the sense that God has to follow any rules. And that the self-sacrifice for God is a self-sacrifice for an ideal that we appreciate. The truth is much scarier and much more profound. The Jewish self-sacrifice that's demanded is much scarier and much more profound. The Jewish self-sacrifice is a self-sacrifice for God himself personally, not as he conforms or fits in any idea or ideology. And that's why the previous tests wouldn't have amounted to anything without the Akeida, right? Avram was willing to die in the fiery furnace, right? But the question would always be, did he do that merely because of his beliefs, right? In other words, did he do that merely because of the concept of God that he understood? Or did he really do that for God himself in the Jewish way? And the Akeida proves retroactively that, on the contrary, Avram did it in the Jewish way. Avram did it for God himself. All of this is most utterly relevant to everything that takes place nowadays, everything that we see in the news, everything that's going on in current events. I will spell it out for you. Many, many, many are the people who think that because they are part of something bigger than themselves, like an Aztec sun worshiper, that they are selfless, right? That's true self-sacrifice, right? That surely I've totally given of myself to go to some kind of protest where I'm part of something that is bigger than me, right? The truth is, it works even in the side of good. It's stronger. It's harder to grasp, but the point is strong enough that it works even for good things, right? Even if I go to a protest that's for Israel and for the people that died in Israel and for real justice, etc. Even if I subscribe to this whole set of comfortable ideological beliefs, even if they're true, right? Which is a big if. But even if they're true, it's not God, and it's not the Jewish self-sacrifice, which means that in the eyes of Judaism, this is still not the level of true selflessness. There's a side of selfishness to this type of altruism. It's not really altruistic. To merely be part of something that is bigger than you can be delving into the deepest depths of selfishness. Right? Because it's fake. You're saying, I'm setting aside my own personal needs, which I guess is like me eating or something, right? To just use a simple example, right? To go and protest for what's something that's perfectly anodyne, to save the whales, right? I don't think they even protest for that anymore, but when I was a kid, that's what they used to protest for pollution and all that, right? So let's say you want to go and protest to save the whales. I agree, we should save the whales. I'm on board, right? Let's say you go and protest to save the whales. There's a certain self-deception involved in this, which is a rampant and endemic self-deception in our society. In other words, this is once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. You convince yourself that because you're not eating, but are part of this more glorious and higher reality, like the sun in an Aztec temple, right? That somehow, right, you've made the difficult act of exchanging your own selfish needs for the selfless pursuits of ideology and what's right, quote unquote, right? Comes the Akeida and it says it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. The person who lives their regular life, maybe they aren't sacrificing for something bigger than themselves, but at least there's no deception. There's no lies, right? I'm living for myself. I agree that what I live is mostly for my own self-sufficiency, perhaps to some extent my self-perfection. And that's fine, right? I mean, it's not the highest ideal, right? But it's honest. I live for myself. I'm here for myself and my own self-perfection. The person who believes they're truly being selfless by protesting to save the whales, right, thinks that they've done real work and real self-transformation to set aside the small, humble, responsibilities of a private citizen, right? To become a true participant in a cause, citizen of the world, a person with ideas, so to speak, right? But just like the Aztec sun worshiper, right? The entire goal is not to become nothing. The entire goal is not to set yourself aside. It looks like you're setting yourself aside. That's the core deception, the core evil of this, right? It looks like you set yourself aside. You can say, I'm so much better than the private citizen, so much smarter, so much wiser, so much in tune with the pain of others, very common nowadays. When in fact, all you're doing is seeking greater immortality for yourself. You're seeking greater being for yourself. You're seeking, I'm not going to be a finite human being, I'm going to be as eternal as the sun, right? What could be more idolatrous than that? My life, my finite life that God has given me is not good enough. I'm going to become an idea, right? It is setting aside the self, but in the wrong way. The real setting aside the self is to recognize the importance of another self. That's the real setting aside the self. That's the Akeida. Avram sets aside everything of himself to do what God wants, right? And God, not God as he's making sense, God as he's totally beyond my understanding, right? That's the real Akeida. To protest to save the whales is also setting aside the self, right? But what's the real setting aside the self? It means I'm setting aside the small realm where I can damage things in my own personal and private life, right? And instead I'm saying that everything is my business. Everything, I'm not a mere person, I'm an idea. I'm a world-changing idea. I'm a cosmic idea. I'm subsumed in the great cosmic justice that is going to come and repair and fix the world, right? And when I conform to that vision, I'm no mere individual. I am part of the many. I'm part of the collective. And more importantly, I'm part of the collective's shared consciousness. I conform myself to that vision. I conform myself to that goal. And everyone that doesn't conform to it, right, obviously, is the opposite of the vision. You know what you can do to them? You can do anything to them. Why? Because we've decided that the personal self is not what's highest. That's not what matters. That's not where reality is. It's not in the personal self. Reality is in the form and the idea and the thing that I subsume myself into, which has all these rules and shapes, right? The Akeida is the opposite. The Akeida is saying rules, shapes, a person is what's real. A self is what's real. If you really want to be selfless, give your understanding of what's right away to someone else. Let someone else tell you what's right. And in a way where you have zero preconditions, right? You have zero preconditions. This person could say anything. He could say the most insane thing ever. He could say, kill me, right? He could say, set aside any and all thoughts of goodness and righteousness and what's right. That's true selflessness. True selflessness, right, is to give yourself away for that other person. And what's the paradox? The paradox is that in the end, this doesn't destroy Avram's rational appreciation of God. On the contrary, it's the foundation. It strengthens the rational appreciation of God, because God becomes, even though God has become super rational, God has become someone who stands apart from and beyond any conceptions and ideas, right? A conception, an idea as chosen by the person of God is more powerful and more real than a conception, an idea that is synonymous with God. Again, it's a higher form of reality. It's elevating God to be as great as the greatest and most free thing you know, which is yourself, right? It's truly, it's the highest place that you can place God. And then when God says, I quite rationally don't want you to murder and steal, and I rationally want you to give charity and steward the earth and save the whales, right? When it's done for him and not for the sake of the ideology, it doesn't just fail to descend into selfless idolatry. It's also a much stronger principle. In the end, it will out. In the end, it will be the eternal principle, the right way of doing it, the most rational, it's the rational system that is going to last and prevail. It doesn't become arbitrary. On the contrary, why? Because the secret is that all rational systems are chosen by people in human intellect, right? Save the Whales was chosen by people, and people were beyond that idea that they chose in the first place. So all rationality is grounded in an unjudgeable individual in the exact same way that God's rationality, which is the morality set out in the Torah, the morality set out in divine revelation, the way a Jew is supposed to live, right, is yet another example. The only difference is that because of the Akeida, we don't lose the person for the idea, for the system. God never reduces to the system. God is beyond the system. And on the contrary, a person choosing the system makes the system much stronger than a system that is merely for its own sake, a system that is self-contained. And this is the real lesson of the Akeida. That's who dies in the Akeida. That's the solution to the murder mystery. The solution to the murder mystery is that at the Akeida, we destroyed Abraham, for all time, for all of his descendants, was the first person to have Jewish self-sacrifice, which means to set aside God who is less than a person. Set aside God who always follows your expectations, who always follows the rules and the systems, even the systems that he himself set out. Right? God is beyond all of that. None of that stops and prevents God. On the contrary, he is beyond and transcendent. And that set the standard for all time for Jewish self-sacrifice, which is why all isms and all movements and all ideologies, even Save the Whales, all eventually turn on the Jews, which also connects to last week's class. Because the Jew, in his very being, remember, Isaac is the personification, right? Every Jew is the personification of this notion that no ideology and no system, no set of beliefs, no matter how high, no matter how holy, not even God's set of beliefs, right, encompass the entire reality. And so every set of beliefs and every worldview eventually breaks on the Jew. There's some part of the Jew that doesn't fit into the cookie cutter, right? And that's why all idolaters eventually come to hate the Jews, and we have a long story in Jewish history. But this is the mystery. This is the solved mystery of who dies at the Akeida. All right, we'll have another class next week.